Hey, class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are past the halfway point and we are moving into the topic of friendship and love. We think about the topic of adjustment, being able to adjust to the world, the stress that life brings. I mean, all the things that are kind of built into this experience of being a human being. It can be really hard sometimes. It can be really difficult to deal with those things, but the relationships we have, the friendships, the love, whether that's romantic or platonic or familial, those are the things that kind of make life, worth living and make it easier to adjust. So that's what this topic of this chapter will be focused on. So we'll start off with some learning objectives after we after this section on relationship development, how we form relationships. You should be able to describe typical characteristics of close relationships and also explain the paradox of close relationships, discuss roles of proximity, familiarity, and physical attractiveness in initial attraction, explain what is known about aspects of physical attractiveness, including the matching hypothesis and attractiveness as a resource. You'll also be able to understand the roles of reciprocity and similarity and getting acquainted, like getting to know somebody, outline some commonly used relationship maintenance strategies. How do you keep, once you've established a friendship or a relationship, how do you keep it going? And then summarize interdependence theory and explain how things like rewards, costs, and investments influence relationship satisfaction and commitment to the overall relationship. So really what we're talking about is how do we develop close relationships with other people? And I mean, close relationships, meaning like it's important, it's interdependent, it's long lasting versus a relationship. Maybe you have a coworker who sits next to you and maybe you wouldn't necessarily call that important. It's not interdependent. You just both do the same job and it's only lasting as long as, one or both of you work there. But close relationships come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and forms. We have some of the first relationships we form, obviously, are with our family, the people who raise us, whether that's our biological parents, or maybe it's, or maybe it's somebody else, grandparents, or, other individuals, other adults, perhaps. Now we have friendships, we have work relationships, which, can be long lasting, romantic relationships, and then eventually, sort of the way our society is set up is if those romantic relationships evolve to a certain extent, then leads to marriage, forming, kind of forming of two families coming together. So kind of forming even closer relationships. So it's interesting how the dynamics of relationships can kind of affect one another. So close relationships, there's an interesting sort of paradox that exists with our close relationships because we get very close to people, whether it's our family, our friends, our romantic, partners, girlfriend, boyfriend, etc., husband, wife. These relationships are prone to arousing intense emotions or feelings, both positively and negatively. The people that we love can bring us lots of joy and they can evoke emotions like caring and compassion and sympathy, but they can also in the same time drive us crazy. It's the people who know us the most and the people we're closest to, it seems like they're the ones who know how to push buttons that can send us, completely off the handle. So that's why this is sometimes referred to as the paradox of close relationships. It's, you're going to get both highs and lows when it comes to a close relationship. The closer it gets, the more intimate you become. So thinking about how, relationships develop, that initial encounter, kind of that first impression. And there are three factors that psychologists have identified that are very influential in terms of initial attraction between two strangers. And when I say attraction, we could be talking romantic attraction, but we also could be talking about, platonic attraction. Like, hey, you look like somebody I might want to hang out with and be friends with, and that can, the same thing can apply to, hey, you look like somebody I want to date or hang out with romantically. So those factors are proximity. We tend to like people who are closer to us, whether that's, geographically, spatially, or what have you. Proximity helps a lot. Now, some of those dynamics are changing because of, like cell phone technology, internet technology allows us to kind of change what we mean by proximity. I mean, now you can put on a VR headset set and be in maybe not the same room as somebody, but you can interact with that person, in a space that is as close to proximity as you can get. So that we might have to revisit how we think about that specific variable going forward. Familiarity, the more familiar we become with someone, the more likely we are to develop a liking for that person, or that, and this is in psychology identified as the mere exposure effect. The more times we get exposed to something, we're more likely to develop positive feelings. Think about it in terms of like, certain people kind of grow on you. Maybe at first you're like, I don't know about this person, but if you spend enough time with them, maybe you get to know them more. You're more likely to generate positive feelings, which makes sense because, the more you're familiar with somebody, the more you maybe find common similarities. You're like, oh, you like this, I like this too. I didn't know this at first, now I do. And then physical attractiveness, and this is perhaps pertaining more towards romantic relationships. But this also does factor into, into friendships. There's a lot of importance put into physical attractiveness, but it should be noted that it's not the most important factor, especially for males and for females. Developing romantic and friendships, things like kindness, humor, intelligence typically are rated higher in research that looks into, these initial attractions. So that kind of gets into the question of, well, what makes something or what makes someone attractive, excuse me. There's a lot of research that's looked into facial features. For example, women who are considered more baby-faced, quote unquote baby-faced, having larger eyes, smaller nose, combined with what are considered more mature features, prominent cheekbones, tend to be rated as more attractive, whereas men, strong jaw, broad forehead, things like that are kind of, maybe characteristics we might deem to be attractive in terms of physique. For women, it's an emphasis on thinness. For men, it's not so much to be thinner, but it's also muscular. And especially as you get age, kind of, that muscular build. But although that's kind of changing now, we see a greater emphasis on quote unquote the dad bod. So, maybe these standards of what we considered physique and attractiveness are altering and changing before our very eyes. Also ways in which individuals, take care of themselves, how they groom, how they bathe themselves are also associated with, desirability. We tend to be more attracted to people who take care of themselves, who are, look like they're on top of things in terms of taking care of their health and all of those things. But if we were ever, doubting whether or not physical appearance matters, the research, the data that shows, I think it's the blue bar is 1997, the green bar is 2011. So a little bit obviously out of date, but we can see growths every single one of these plastic surgery procedures intended to alter and change the physical body, especially trying to meet towards certain aesthetics of beauty, like thinness, for example, are only increased. Now obviously this goes to 2011. I don't know what the data is currently, but my guess is it's probably continuing to go up. So again, what makes people attractive? We like things we like in terms of looks. There's also this idea of the matching hypothesis that, people who are kind of geared towards their similar levels of physical attractiveness gravitate towards each other. And so I don't love this, but you hear sometimes people are ranked in terms of their number of attractiveness, like 1 through 10, like, that person's a 10, that person's a 9, that person's a whatever. And that's kind of what this matching hypothesis is saying, is that if, you're a quote unquote 10, you're probably only going to, maybe be attracted to other 10s or whatever. And, I guess the downside of that is if you're a, quote unquote 7, that means it's going to be difficult for you to maybe get an 8 or a 9 or a 10 to be attractive to you. I guess that's sort of what this idea is, but we tend to be attractive to people who are more matched to us in a number of dimensions. Attractiveness could certainly be one of them. Okay. So kind of thinking about this, element of attractiveness, there's the other theories about this as well. One of those is this idea of resource exchange. basically that in dating situations, the exchange happening is that males are exchanging or trading their occupational status for physical attractiveness in females. So basically, it's identifying what each gender is looking for in the opposite. So, for example, males in this case would be looking for physically attractive females, and females would be looking for men who have higher status in terms of maybe their occupation, their job, their career, something like that. So it's sort of this idea that something is being exchanged in the relationship, and it's being depicted here in this comic. Maybe this is a blind date. Oh, it is a blind date. Sorry, the caption says 1 second before the blind date. He's picturing a very what appears to be a very attractive woman, and she's picturing a wallet full of money, and it looks like a key ring that has a Mercedes Benz on it. So very different expectations. And kind of taking this even further, David Buss, 1988, theories as old as I am, but looked at this idea of kind of taking this exchange theory one step further with the idea of parental investment theory, which this theory says that mating patterns, for example, who we choose to form romantic relationships with, so for status, physical attractiveness, things like that, are depend on what each sex prioritizes in terms of their survival. So this is really starting to enter, bring in elements of evolutionary psychology. So if we're thinking about it from a male perspective, reproductive opportunities, the opportunities to keep the species going are most important in terms of, the connection to physical attractiveness, whereas women are more likely to choose men who are supplying resources to support the offspring that they're, going to produce together. So this is very economical, very evolutionary, kind of black and white, sort of taking a lot of the emotion out of relationship formation. And so this is sort of what and what this might look like sort of on a chart. You have males, their reproduction involves minimal investment, which maximizes reproductive success, in terms of influencing the seeking out of more sexual partners, which might result in terms of behavioral outcomes, more interest in uncommitted sex, versus women. Reproduction involves substantial investment of time, energy, risk. And the significance of this is to maximize reproductive success by finding partners who are more interested in committal and providing resources for the offspring. So these very kind of economic arguments go all the way back, thinking about how we were likely forming relationships at the very beginning of human history. So thinking about in terms of whether relationships continue. So maybe you have that initial attraction. Hey, I like you, I want you to be my friend. Or hey, I like you, I want you to be my boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, husband, wife, whatever. Whether those relationships continue, whether they are viable. A couple of factors have been identified by psychologists. One is reciprocal liking, meaning you like the same things. We like the same movies, we like the same sports teams, we like, and also being similar, having similar characteristics, similar qualities. You don't just like the same stuff. You have similar attitudes about, maybe key issues or maybe things of importance to you. You have similar values, similar, mores and ways in which you choose to live your life. And then once you've established the relationship, though, you have to maintain it. It is work. It's work to build an initial relationship, and it's also work in terms of maintaining a relationship. So what I mean by maintenance is any kind of actions or things that you're doing to sustain the quality of that relationship. So, maybe that in a platonic relationship, maybe that means, shooting a text to your buddy and checking in, or saying, hey, did you watch the game last night? But, maybe for your romantic partner, that might mean, oh, we got to plan a date night. We got to plan stuff to do and spend time together. So the kind of relationship you have will maybe influence the kind of maintenance work that goes into it. So some examples, maintaining more positivity in the relationship, trying to be nice, be cheerful, task sharing, equally sharing tasks, things that may need to get done. Maybe it's like your roommate, you're like, hey, let's both knock the dishes out together, all clean, you put away, things like that. Okay, so relationships in terms of whether or not they persist comes down to satisfaction and commitment. And so, what determines whether or not you will stay in a relationship or you'll get out? So, whether you'll continue to be friends with somebody, whether you'll continue to be in a romantic relationship. One particular theory, the social exchange theory or interdependence, however you want to state it, says that really it's economics, it's a cost benefit analysis that we sort of do, whether consciously or unconsciously, where ideally we're hoping that the rewards outweigh the costs, meaning what you get out of the relationship is more than you have to put in. So this is sort of, again, very much an economic kind of way of thinking about it, but thinking about satisfaction, improving satisfaction, that's huge in terms of promoting commitment. And satisfaction is also, it's based on comparison. It's sort of normative. We might compare it to other relationships we see around us and determine, oh well, these things are happening in this relationship and they're not happening in mine, therefore I'm not satisfied, or we're doing these things in this relationship that other people aren't. And I think that could be leading to the satisfaction. So it's not only it's the outcomes you're experiencing in one relationship, but versus other relationships that you've been in versus relationships you see around you can have profound influence. But further going into this idea of commitment, this idea of interdependence is really getting down to investments. We ideally in a relationship, we want to put what we put in, we want to be able to get back and then some, ideally, like make it worth our time, make it worth our effort. And again, these maybe aren't things you're necessarily thinking about like consciously, like, oh, I hope my friend, gives me something today. Otherwise, I'm not going to be their friend anymore. It's probably not that cold and calculated, but these are ways in which sort of socially we might be kind of hardwired to navigate whether or not the relationship is successful or not. So thinking about it, we can look at it mathematically. You have your rewards, the cost of the rewards of the relationship minus the cost equals the outcome, or the outcome minus the comparison level, maybe compared to a previous relationship or another relationship that about, leads to satisfaction. Satisfaction minus the alternatives plus investments leads to commitment. So you can kind of see how all of these different variables are related to one another. Okay, we're going to switch gears and specifically look at friendship. So first, or by the end of this section, you should be able to summarize research on what makes a good friend, describe key gender and sexual orientation differences in relationships or friendships, and explain the friendship repair ritual as a way of dealing with conflict in friendships, because conflict happens. You're not always gonna, even with your best friend, you're not always going to agree. You may like all the same stuff, but eventually you're going to probably come into some degree of conflict. So starting off, what makes a good friend? Lots of different factors. I mean, there's maybe not one singular factor, but ultimately good friends are the ones that provide both emotional and social support to each other. And again, that's a broad umbrella. I mean, social support could be like, hey, I'm broke and I need you to float me some money until I can pay rent, and get paid next week. Or emotional support, hey, I need you to listen to me right while I vent. All those different ways in which we can offer support. But support is ultimately what determines whether or not a friendship might be considered good or not. So in terms of different perspectives, friendship based on gender or sexual orientation, research has shown that women's friendships are more symmetrical, reciprocal, and emotionally based. Men's tend to be more higher in agency in terms of what you can do, what you can do, what you can help with. Women are more likely to discuss personal matters, relationships, and their feelings, and men are more likely to discuss shared interests and activities. In terms of sexual orientation, we do see boundaries are present between friendship and love relationships tend to be more complex in homosexual, gay, lesbian relationships. The research also shows that lesbians and gay men are more likely to maintain social contact with former sexual partners. And then the size of the actual network, the social network for gay and lesbians, tends to be smaller than heterosexual counterparts. And there also tends to be less support from families and society. Now we are seeing that change, but obviously there's still room to grow. Oops, sorry. Oops. What happens when we deal with conflict? What happens if you get in a fight, get in an argument with, a friend? I mean, there are different steps that you can take to repair the conflict. One of those is reproach. The offended party confronts the offender, and asks for some kind of explanation. Hey, you said this and I didn't like it. Tell me why. Remedy, the offender takes responsibility, offers an apology. Hey, I recognize what I said was wrong. I'm sorry. And then acknowledgement, the offended party accepts the apology and the friendship continues. Ideally, this is where you can remedy the conflict. This is a pretty, it's maybe not so linear, like, okay, you do this, I do this, you do that, but these are just ways in which you can make the conflict, deal with it directly, and talk about the impact the conflict has and actually move through it rather than, just putting up a wall and ignoring it. What about romantic love? We're going to switch gears from friendship to romantic love. So by the end of this section, you should be able to identify some gender differences regarding love, clarify research findings on the experience of love in gay and straight couples, compare Sternberg's triangular theory of love with the theory of adult attachment styles, discuss the course of romantic love over time, including what couples go through as they dissolve a relationship, and explain why relationships fail and what couples can do to help relationships last. So when we think about, love, a lot of that, who you are romantically attracted to is strongly, it's influenced by your sexual orientation, who is your preference, for emotional and sexual relationships. It could be to the same gender, could be other gender, or it could be to either gender. Unfortunately, a lot of research in psychology, and until recently, and even still to this day, suffers from what is called heterosexism. Basically, a lot of the research kind of looks at sexual romantic relationships through the lens of heterosexual couples. And now we because of that, we just don't know as much. We don't know nearly as much about homosexual relationships as we do, heterosexual relationships. So, and I think that's starting to change because one, I mean, same-sex marriage is legal. It hasn't been legal for very long, but it is now. And so I think that, we have, relationships to compare. Like you can compare married couples who are homosexual and married couples who are heterosexual, but still, there is this kind of bias, this heterosexual bias that has found its way, into research on romantic relationships. However, based on what we do know, on the limited information we do know, those relationships tend to be the same. I mean, a lot of the same dynamics in homosexual relationships tend to be present in heterosexual and vice versa. But still, I mean, obviously we want to make sure that representation, that stuff matters. So to have a better understanding of what's going on, it's more important to be inclusive. So one of the more prominent theories of love and romantic attraction comes from Sternberg, who you've probably heard about in previous chapters of this course, or maybe intro psych. He talked about the triangular theory of love. Sternberg liked things in threes, and in terms of romantic relationships are built on some combination of the three components of intimacy, how close we are, how likely we are to share and, personally disclose with somebody. Passion, meaning intensity of our feelings. Commitment, whether or not, hey, I'm committed to just this person, or maybe I, like other people as well. But based on this sort of those three different components, Sternberg identified sort of 8 different types of relationships that are present or that exist based on the presence or absence of any of these 3 components. And ultimately, when you have that balance of the 3, intimacy, passion, commitment, when all 3 are present, this is called consummate love. And according to Sternberg, this is like the gold standard. But here are the other different types, so this is kind of the sweet spot. But there's liking, maybe just intimacy alone. Companionate love is intimacy and commitment. Empty love, is just commitment alone. Fatuous love is passion with commitment. Infatuation is just passion. And romantic love is intimacy and passion. And in any given relationship, your relationship might evolve and kind of ebb and flow into these different types of love. So, but ultimately, this is kind of the sweet spot when you can have all 3 of these elements present. Some other research kind of looking at love and attachment comes from Hazen and Shaver, and they explored the role of attachment patterns, attachment styles that we form early in life, and how those attachment styles influence adult relationships. So they did, research with various participants. They had some who were considered secure adults, meaning they formed secure attachments in childhood. Now they're forming secure relationships as adults, avoidant adults, and anxious, ambivalent adults. So the various ranges of different types. Brandon, Clark, and Shaver kind of expanding upon this. They looked at adult attachment styles and looked at two different factors that are used for explaining the different attachment styles. So one for explaining attachment anxiety, how much a person worries that a partner will not be available when needed, or attachment avoided. This is the degree to which a person distrusts a partner's goodwill and their tendencies to maintain emotional and behavioral distance. These two dimensions kind of yield 4 different attachment styles as depicted here. So somebody who is low in avoidance, low in anxiety would be more of a secure attachment. One who is high in anxiety, high or low in avoidance would be preoccupied. High in both would be avoidant, dismissing, and then high in attachment, low, or excuse me, high is avoidant, fearful, and these are ways in which we might manifest attachment or lack thereof in our relationship. So some interesting research kind of looking at the role of attachment and what correlates. Securely attached people tend to have more committed, satisfying, interdependent relationships, long-lasting relationships. Securely attached people tend to have better mental health. And then, having that partner also is, having a partner can also, there's a lot of negative kind of outcomes associated with having an insecure attachment, but having a partner can help kind of insulate or buffer from some of those, maybe social or health consequences. And looking at attachment style from a long-term standpoint, looking at it from longitudinal research show that it's fairly stable, especially for the first 19 years of life. Basically going from childhood into adulthood, attachment style is pretty stable. Doesn't mean it can't change, but it's fairly difficult to change. They can be altered by life events. Both positive and negative events can alter those things. So it's definitely not written in stone, but it's one of those things that's not always easy to change. Sternberg's theory is really interesting because it helps predict the strength of it helps show that relationships will change and evolve based on the strength of those components. For example, passion tends to peak pretty early in a relationship, but eventually kind of decreases in intensity over time. Intimacy and commitment tend to increase as time progresses. Those are things that, kind of go up maybe as passion is going down, maybe the passion goes down, but the depth of your relationship increases. So we can kind of see how over time, how these might look. Passion starts pretty high, typically higher than intimacy and commitment, but over time it's commitment, it's intimacy that kind of, outweigh the passion. So why do relationships end? One, premature commitment. Maybe you committed to a relationship that maybe you or the other person weren't ready for. Ineffective communication skills, ineffective conflict managing skills, getting bored, availability of other alternatives, low levels of satisfaction. Could be a combination, all of these. But things to consider. When they end, breakups are a process. It's not. Even there's that one breakup event, there's still steps kind of before and after that lead up before the relationship is over. There's sort of psychologists have identified sort of 6 stages in terms of relationship disillusion, meaning it'll end. And then there's lots of variation in terms of how people adjust to break up. So, with that in mind, what can you do to help relationships last, to go the distance, making sure one of those is plenty of time to get to know each other before you make that long-term commitment, really make sure you understand the other person and you understand yourself. Emphasizing positive qualities when you're thinking about your significant other, work on your conflict management skills, and then find ways to bring novelty to the relationship. And that doesn't mean spice it up romantically, sexually. It could be hey, we find new things to do together, new places to travel, new things to do new activities to do together. Okay, now switching gears and looking at a new, more recent phenomenon when it comes to relationships, and it's the internet. So after this section, you should be able to clarify how differences between internet and face-to-face interactions affect the development of a relationship, describe the pros and cons of building intimacy online, and discuss the role of the internet in face-to-face interactions. So nowadays, relationships can be formed. 50 years ago, you would have to meet people, maybe in public, maybe at place of place in public, maybe a bar or the mall or a sporting event, wherever. Now, I mean, you can meet people, never have to leave your house. I mean, you can do all that seemingly from your phone, and it offers so many different avenues for communication about attraction that were just not present before, and also allows people to communicate in ways that maybe they weren't comfortable doing before. So there are advantages to internet communication in terms of you have a lot more access to potential people, friends, romantic partners. It's easy to communicate. I mean, it could literally be at your fingertips, and the ability to match with potential compatible partners is made easy. There are apps, for example, that try to filter with algorithms and things like that, and bring you into contact with people who are similar to you. Maybe that's your interest, or people you might be attracted to, or things like that. And also things, technology, emails, instant messaging, services like that make it easier to disclose feelings and kind of open up in ways that maybe were not possible before. So, however, research, there's a lot of debate about, are these real relationships in terms of, these virtual digital online relationships? But there's a lot of research that shows that online virtual, relationships can be just as intimate or even closer than face-to-face ones. However, there are problems. I mean, for one, people can misrepresent themselves online. I mean, you can say you have a lot more money than you really do. You're younger or older than you really are. You're taller, shorter, skinnier, bigger, whatever. There are a lot more ways to misrepresent yourself that are just not possible to do it in person. So you hear about things like catfishing, for example, that just, are very much more difficult if you were doing that in person, if not impossible. Virtual relationships tend to be just as stable as traditional ones. And online communication is really a great way to maintain relationships. Prior to the invention of cell phones, if you wanted to talk to your buddy, you had to, call your buddy. You had to write him a letter. Nowadays, you can just fire off a text and be like, "Hey, did you watch the game last night?" And you can have a whole conversation about something and never even be in the same room or even have the phone to your ear. However, excessive use in terms of technology can be associated with less intimacy. There is such thing as too much of a good thing. Okay, last thing we're going to look at is applying some of our understanding about friendships, relationships, and to overcome the phenomena of loneliness. So by the end of this section, you should be able to describe what loneliness is, discuss its prevalence, explain how early experiences and current social trends contribute to loneliness, understand how shyness, poor social skills, self-defeating attributions contribute to loneliness, and summarize suggestions for conquering loneliness. So loneliness, what is it? There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. People can be alone and feel perfectly fine. People can be in a crowded room of other people and yet feel completely lonely. And this means when you have fewer interpersonal relationships than you desire, or when those relationships you do have are not as satisfying. So it could be the lack thereof in terms of the relationships themselves, or the lack thereof in terms of quality, or even both. Loneliness can take shape in terms of emotional loneliness, social loneliness, transient loneliness. Maybe this happens in terms of like COVID, for example, completely changed how our social networks were connected. Before, it's like maybe you go out and see your friends every weekend or every night or whatever. Now with COVID, it's like, well, I have to be more careful about that. And there was a whole year and a half where that was not possible for a lot of people. Chronic loneliness is where this is happening again and again and again, and it's a sort of an inability to form relationships or close relationships. So how prevalent is it? It's more prevalent amongst the youth, especially teens who identify as LGBTQ. It's more prevalent among single, divorced, and widowed adults, the elderly, and individuals whose parents have divorced. So loneliness can affect all of us, but there are some groups who tend to be more prone to experiencing loneliness. So where does it come from? Early experiences in life, for example, inappropriate behavior in children can lead to rejection by their peers, like children who too aggressive, too aloof, too competitive, for example, might be rejected by their peers. There's also social trends, certain schedules. We don't, I mean, there's a really interesting book I read by Robert Putnam, who talked about, trends in, bowling leagues have just been on the decline. We spend more time watching TV and using computers, for example, than going out and doing things like, bowling and being involved in like recreational leagues and stuff like that. I think it's just called bowling alone, but that's another aspect of loneliness. Even though you can technically connect to 1 million people on your phone, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be any less lonely. Another contributor to loneliness is shyness, this, excessive caution or inhibition or discomfort in social situations. People who are shy tend to be more timid. They're more overly self-conscious. They're easily embarrassed and actually feel or experience physiological symptoms of anxiety when they're in these social situations. It's like their fight or flight kicks in. Other correlates with loneliness: poor social skills. People who are lonely tend to show low responsiveness to conversational partners, meaning they're maybe not even really listening actively. They're less likely to disclose about themselves. And they might even engage in what's considered a self-defeating attributional style, meaning they think negatively about situations, leads them to behave in ways that kind of confirm those expectations. So, for example, lonely people might engage in more negative self-talk, which fosters ideas that kind of keep the loneliness going. So some examples of that might be, I'm undesirable, I'm dull and boring, which might lead to avoidance of friendship. I can't communicate with other people, leads to low to self-disclosure. I can't seem to get what I want from this relationship, leads to lack of assertiveness within the relationship. So what can be done to conquer loneliness? Research shows that chronic loneliness is associated with a number of physical and mental health problems. So simply taking care of your mental and physical health can go a long way. Loneliness can be overcome by, things like the internet, using the internet to maybe alleviate the anxiety that's created by face-to-face interactions, maybe use that to open doors for future face-to-face interactions. And this allows people, the ability to maintain social interaction without avoiding or withdrawing. Try to challenge those self-defeating attributional styles, those cognitive patterns. Maybe that involves going to therapy or whatever, but being aware of those and challenging those thoughts can go a long way. Cultivating social skills. I mean, social skills are like a muscle. The more you use them, the more they practice, the better they get. And then also consider seeking help from a counselor if it is something that, it's leading to distress, to dysfunction, all of the things, impairing life function, then it certainly is something worth exploring with professionals in mental health. So that's going to wrap it up for chapter 9. We're going to come back with chapter 10. So let me know if you have any questions in the comment section or just drop them in Canvas after watching this video. So thanks. Take care. Bye.